The sadistic murderer is almost always male. The seeds of his abnormalities would seem to be planted at a very early age, and a careful history will often show clear evidence of some manifestations of his perversions even before puberty.
In the swinging 60s, Glasgow's dance halls pulsed with life and laughter. But beneath the glittering lights of the Barrowland Ballroom, a sinister predator lurked. Known only as Bible John, this elusive killer would leave an indelible mark on Scotland's criminal history, claiming 3 lives and spawning one of the largest manhunts the country had ever seen. On a cold Friday morning, February 23rd of 1968, 67-year-old Maurice Goodman was walking down Carmichael Place in Glasgow in Scotland. Finding people passed out after a night of dancing was fairly typical, but this morning was different. As Maurice got closer to the figure on the ground, he realised something was seriously wrong. The young woman laying there without any clothes on, extremely pale and very still. When Maurice tried to wake her, he felt that she was cold and unresponsive like a block of ice. Terrified, Maurice rushed home to call the police. Unknowingly, he just triggered one of the largest and most baffling investigations in Scotland's history. Detective Sergeant Andrew Johnson and Detective Constable Norman MacDonald arrived at the scene around 8:10 in the morning, expecting to find a case of death from exposure. However, as they looked closer, they noticed ligature marks on the woman's neck, revealing that this was not an accident, but a murder. Police pathologist Dr. James Imrie determined that the victim had been dead for several hours before she was discovered. Her clothes and the murder weapon were nowhere to be seen. The victim had suffered severe injuries to her face and head, and Dr. Imrie speculated that she had been strangled with a belt. The autopsy did indeed confirm that the woman had died from strangulation, although there were no clear signs of any. It was strongly suspected that she had been. The medical examiner noted that the woman was menstruating at the time of her death, which seemed unimportant at first, but would later become a crucial detail. Investigators found a sanitary towel at the crime scene, even though the killer had meticulously removed everything else. The police conducted an extensive door-to-door inquiry to find witnesses and try to identify the victim. Despite a big party in the neighbourhood that night, no one recalled seeing or hearing anything unusual. Only one woman reported hearing a woman scream, "Leave me alone," twice on Thursday evening. This could have well been the victim's last words, but there was no way to confirm this. Ultimately, the inquiries left the police with very few leads and no closer to identifying this poor woman. However, a breakthrough came unexpectedly when an ambulance driver saw the body at the morgue at Victoria Hospital. Despite the severe facial injuries that had prevented other employees from recognising her, this driver identified the woman as Patricia Docker, a 25-year-old nursing assistant. The driver's suspicion was confirmed the next day when John Wilson, Patricia's father, came to the police station to report his daughter missing. She had not returned home after spending a night at the Majestic Ballroom. Detectives immediately recognised the young woman in the photo that John brought with him. John was then taken to the morgue, where he officially identified the murdered young lady as his daughter Patricia. Patricia Docker had been a lively young woman with a cheeky smile, short brown wavy hair, gentle hazel eyes and a slim 5'3" figure. She worked as a nurse at Mearnskirk Hospital in Renfrewshire, covering night shifts that started at 10 p.m. and ended the following morning at 8 a.m. Her work, and being a single mother to her 4-year-old son, well, that kept Patricia busy. She had married Alex Docker, her son's father, 5 years earlier, but they had since separated. After the separation, Patricia moved back in with her parents at their home in Glasgow at 29 Langside Place. Having her parents around gave Patricia the chance to occasionally enjoy a wee night out without her son. According to John, that was exactly what his daughter planned to do on the night of her murder. He told detectives that Patricia had gone out that Thursday night to meet her friends at the Majestic Ballroom on Hope Street in the city centre of Glasgow. Back in the 1960s, ballrooms were hugely popular all across the UK, second only to cinemas. In Glasgow alone, there were 14 permanent dance halls like the Locarno, the Majestic and the Plaza. A newspaper survey from that time showed just how important these ballrooms were, revealing that up to 70% of all married couples in the UK had met whilst dancing at one of these places. Patricia and her estranged husband had also met at a dance hall, but even though their marriage didn't last, Patricia's passion for dancing still remained strong. Knowing who the victim was and her plans before her death, the police began to trace Patricia's final steps. Detectives interviewed people who had been at the Majestic Ballroom on that Thursday night, which was February the 22nd. They even found a witness who recalled dancing with Patricia, but this person later changed his story, saying that he got the date wrong. It took several days before the police discovered that the Majestic wasn't the only dance hall that Patricia had visited on the night that she was murdered. Patricia and her friends had been dancing at the Majestic Ballroom, listening to the resident band Dr. Cock and the Crackpots, but at some point Patricia had changed the location without her friends. Nobody could say for sure if Patricia always intended to go to another dance hall called the Barrowland Ballroom, or if something drew her there after the Majestic had closed at 10:30 PM that night. One key detail was that Thursdays and Saturdays at the Barrowlands were Palais night, where only those over 25 were allowed in. These nights had quite a reputation. While many single people did come there to dance, drink and flirt, so did many married people, but without their partners. If someone was looking for a wee bit of an extramarital affair or a secret fling, well, Barrowland was the place to be. People even joked about attendees pausing at the entrance to slip off their wedding rings before going inside. One Glasgow resident described the Palais nights by saying, "It was well known that if you wanted a bit more than a dance, then Thursday night was the evening to visit the Barrowland. I don't think many used their actual name on a Thursday night. Folk were cautious. Anything that happened after dancing was finished was usually a one-off." The Barrowland Ballroom's reputation could have been why Patricia didn't mention it to her parents. Despite the fact that she had moved out of her husband's house, Patricia was still technically a married woman, and telling her mum and dad about the Barrowland Ballrooms could have caused an awkward conversation and possibly an argument. Of course, Patricia might have just wanted to keep the night going at the only dance hall still open at that time. Whatever her reason was, by the time detectives realised Patricia had gone to the Barrowland that Thursday night, the trail was already getting cold. Several witnesses came forward saying they saw her in a yellow dress dancing with various different men, including one with red hair. However, no one could remember seeing her leave the place. Patricia's body was discovered around 4.8 kilometres, which is just under 3 miles from the Barrowland Ballroom, and just a few hundred metres from her parents' house. Despite their efforts, the police couldn't find anyone who remembered seeing a young woman in a yellow dress walking along that route. This led them to believe that Patricia might have taken a taxi or gotten a ride, possibly from her killer. Despite extensive searches of the entire area, investigators never found any of Patricia's clothes. However, they did find her brown handbag and bracelet in a small river about 100 metres from where the body was discovered. The police were puzzled about why the killer had thrown away some of Patricia's belongings, but kept her clothes. Perhaps the clothes contained incriminating evidence, or maybe they were just taken as souvenirs. As time passed, instead of finding answers, more questions popped up. The police had only one potential suspect at this point, and that obviously would have been Patricia's ex-husband, Alex. However, he was quickly ruled out when his alibi was confirmed as being airtight. At the time of the murder, he had been at RAF Digby in Lincolnshire, over 250 miles away. As the weeks passed, the inquiry into Patricia Docker's tragic death gradually lost momentum, until it ground to a halt. The memory of the young woman's demise didn't vanish entirely, but it slipped into the shadows. Then, 18 months later, on a Saturday night, August 16th of 1969, 32-year-old Jemima MacDonald, busy making plans for a night at the Barrowland Ballroom, didn't give a second thought to this unsolved murder. Jemima shared many similarities with Patricia. She was also attractive, slender, and a mother of 3 children who adored dancing. The MacDonald family resided in a tenement building on 15 McKeith Street in Bridgeton, close to Jemima's sister Margaret. For the past 2 nights, Margaret had kindly looked after Jemima's 12-year-old daughter and her sons, aged 9 and 7, while she indulged in her love for dancing. Saturday night was no exception. Jemima dropped her children off with Margaret before making her way to the Barrowland Ballroom. She was dressed in a stylish black pinafore dress, a crisp white blouse, off-white slingback shoes and a cosy brown coat. A scarf adorned her head, hiding the curlers underneath. See, she planned to remove these just before entering the dance hall, to ensure that she looked her best. Since many of Jemima's friends were married and committed to their partners, she was attending the dance solo. But this didn't faze her much. Jemima was accustomed to going out alone and was confident that she would find someone to dance with at the over-25s night at the Barrowland. Before making her way to the dance hall, which didn't serve alcohol at the time, she made a pit stop at Betty's bar on the Gallowgate for a wee drink. Saturdays were bustling, with so many as 2,000 dancers packing the floor. Amidst the throng, Jemima lost herself in the music, dancing the night away as if there was no tomorrow. However, the next day arrived, and Jemima failed to pick up her children from her sister as originally planned. Margaret grew increasingly worried. It was totally out of character for Jemima to disappear without a trace, but perhaps she had simply stayed out longer than usual. Then Margaret overheard neighbourhood children gossiping about the body in the tenement. The timing of such a rumour couldn't have been any worse. The abandoned tenement building at 23 McKeith Street nearby was both a playground for children and a haven for vagrants and sex workers. If there truly was a body in that tenement, it might belong to a homeless person. But the coincidence with Jemima's disappearance, well, this unsettled Margaret deeply. By Monday, with still no sign of her sister, Margaret felt compelled to investigate the empty building herself, to confirm whether the unsettling rumours held any truth. As Margaret arrived at 23 McKeith Street, she found several others gathered around the building. Surprised, she ventured inside and was guided to a bed recess by one of the walls on the ground floor. Initially, Margaret mistook the figure laying on the floor for a mannequin, but she drew closer. She recognised the torn black pinafore dress, the white blouse, and the bloodied face, and it was her sister.
More than 30 hours later, her partly clothed body was found in a derelict tenement just 20 yards from her own home. She had been beaten and strangled.
Her body was found in a back court and it was just utter degradation with rubbish and rubble and all the rest of it.
All day on Sunday, children in McKeith Street, Bridgeton played, running in and out of the house where the body was found.
Jemima MacDonald had suffered a savage attack in the early hours of Sunday morning. She was brutally beaten on her head and face. She was strangled with one of her own stockings. Although most of her clothing remained at the scene of the crime, her black patent leather handbag and headscarf, well, they were both missing and remained elusive despite subsequent searches. An autopsy revealed that Jemima had been menstruating at the time of her death, echoing a similarity with Patricia Docker. While this could have been purely coincidental, the discovery of a sanitary pad at the crime scene near the body left investigators pondering whether there might be a connection between these two murders. During interviews with individuals present in the area on the night of Jemima's murder, the police gleaned little useful information. One woman recalled hearing screams, but she couldn't pinpoint the exact time. Another witness claimed to have seen a woman resembling Jemima conversing with a man outside the vacant tenement building around 12:40 a.m. However, uncertainty clouded whether it was indeed Jemima that they had seen. Fortunately though, authorities quickly established that Jemima had indeed been at the Barrowland Ballroom, enabling them to then interview attendees while their recollections were still fairly vivid. Several individuals recalled seeing Jemima at the dance hall and could also describe the man that she was with. According to these witnesses, this man stood out because he appeared to be a bit out of place. He was aged between 25 and 35, he sported a well-tailored suit with hand-stitched lapels, a white shirt and notably short red hair. His attire exuded a sense of sophistication that seemed a touch elevated compared to the typical dancers at the Barrowlands. Witness accounts suggested that this same individual had accompanied Jemima to Betty's bar before the pair then proceeded on to the Barrowland Ballroom. However, none of those who remembered seeing Jemima and her companion could identify the man or recall ever seeing him at the ballroom before. Witnesses later observed Jemima departing with this same man, strolling down Gallowgate before turning right onto Bain Street and continuing onto London Road. Reports reached the police from individuals who spotted the pair walking together on London Road between 12:15 and 12:30 a.m. From there, they reportedly took a shortcut via Ladressy Street and James Street. Now, normally, Jemima's journey home to Macheath Street would have taken around 20 minutes, but tragically, she never reached her destination. Despite the detailed descriptions provided by witnesses, days passed without any potential suspects emerging in this case. Feeling the need for a fresh approach, Detective Chief Superintendent Tom Goodall, head of the City of Glasgow Police CID, turned to George Lennox Patterson. He was the Deputy Director of the Glasgow School of Art. Goodall proposed an unprecedented step at that time, creating a painting of the red-haired man's face. This had never been attempted in the history of Scottish criminal investigation, requiring official permissions from the Crown Office in Edinburgh. Once approval was obtained, a sketch was meticulously crafted based on the witness accounts and unveiled to the press on Tuesday, August 26th. This was 10 days after Jemima's tragic death.
Find this man is Murder Squad plea. Police want to interview this man in their bid to find the killer of Mrs. Mima MacDonald.
Lennox Patterson's sketch of the suspect in Jemima MacDonald's murder quickly became famous. It wasn't just because the drawing was incredibly detailed, but also because of the mocking smile on the suspect's face. People thought that with such a clear picture, someone would surely recognise him soon. However, even though the portrait was all over the media, no clues emerged, and the police still didn't know who this red-haired man was. Just like with Patricia Docker's murder, Jemima's case reached a dead end. Then, only 2 months after Jemima's death, another young woman was killed. Helen Puttock, 29, had just returned to Glasgow with her husband George and their 2 young children after living in Germany for a wee while. George, a corporal in the British Army, had taken Helen with him on his posting, but army life just wasn't her thing. So, by 1969, Helen and their 2 sons, David and Michael, had moved back to Glasgow to live temporarily with her mother at 129 Errol Street. George wanted to be closer to his family, so he applied for a posting nearer Glasgow and spent his leave time with his family. On Thursday, the 30th of October of 1969, George was home in Glasgow and Helen wanted to go dancing with her older sister, Jenny Langford. George wasn't exactly thrilled about Helen going out without him, but thinking, he just thought dancing was inappropriate for a married woman to go out alone. But Helen persuaded him, explaining that she just wanted to have some fun with her sister. After all, as a mother of a 5-year-old and an infant, she didn't get much free time to herself. Before Helen and her sister left for the bus around 8 p.m. that night, George handed his wife 10 shillings for a taxi ride home. Helen, dressed in a black sleeveless dress, black shoes and a fake fur ocelot coat, smiled and promised her husband that she wouldn't stay out too late. The sisters went to a few pubs in the city centre for drinks before heading on to the Barrowland Ballroom, where they arrived around 10 p.m. that night. Although they had heard about Jemima MacDonald's murder just 10 weeks earlier and its possible link to another woman's death, they weren't really too worried. Unlike Jemima and Patricia, Helen and Jeannie had each other for company. I mean, what could go wrong? The next morning, at 7:30, a man named Archibald McIntyre was walking his dog along Errol Street, heading into the enclosed garden behind the apartment buildings there. Suddenly, Archibald's dog started sniffing intensely at something on the ground. Following his pet, Archibald stumbled upon a horrifying sight. The body of a young woman with a pair of stockings knotted around her neck.
A black Labrador dog being taken for an early morning walk by his owner found the body of Helen Puttock in this back court at 95 Errol Street. She had been beaten and strangled. She was lying face downwards at an angle to a wall, her clothes badly displaced. There were signs that at one stage she might have tried to escape from her attacker, run up that embankment and been dragged back.
When the police arrived, they found the woman lying face down. Her clothes were all torn and her face was so badly beaten that she was unrecognisable. A medical examiner later confirmed that the woman had been before being strangled to death. She also had bite marks on her body. Some reports mentioned her wrists, others her buttocks and thighs. Additionally, she had been menstruating at the time, and a sanitary pad was found placed under her left armpit with a semen stain on her tights. The similarities to the deaths of Jemima MacDonald and Patricia Docker were striking. It became clear that a serial killer might be on the loose in Glasgow. After the body was discovered, the police set up an incident caravan outside 95 Earl Street when George Puttock woke up that morning and noticed his wife hadn't returned home. He looked out the window and saw the police caravan right there. While he didn't know why the police were there, he was relieved to have someone to talk to about Helen being missing. So, George went outside and approached the caravan to talk to the cops and explained the situation to the nearest officer. The officer asked what Helen had been wearing the previous night, and when George mentioned the faux fur coat, they realised that the badly beaten body was Helen Puttock.
In the morning when I woke up, she still wasn't home, and I went into the front bedroom and looked out of the window, and I saw a police van. Don't ask me why, but I knew then that something was wrong. And so I went down, and as I'm walking towards the police caravan, I heard people saying, "Oh, there's a girl and she's been murdered." And I got to the caravan and spoke to a policeman, and he obviously went out the back to where Helen was lying, and the chief police officer, Inspector Beattie, came out and said to me, "What was your wife wearing, son?" And I said, a fur ocelot coat, a black dress. And it was then he told me, "I'm sorry, but she has been murdered."
Naturally, the police immediately needed to speak with Jeannie Langford, the person who had gone out with her and been with her all night, and supposedly stayed by her side the entire time. Jeannie, however, was so distraught upon hearing this news about her sister's death that it took a while before the detectives were able to interview her. But when they did, it was learned that Jeannie had not just seen the potential suspect, she had also spoken to him face to face, and they shared a taxi together. According to Jeannie, as soon as they had arrived at the Barrowland Ballroom, she got together with a gentleman who said his name was John. Helen also found herself a companion for the night, a tall young man who appeared suave and a little more sophisticated than normal. The four of them danced and chatted, and the woman eventually laughed after learning both of the men were actually called John, or so they claimed. It wasn't strange for people to use aliases, especially during these over 25 nights, and based on Helen's partner's behaviour, Jeannie felt like he wasn't completely honest, as she later recalled.
"I don't believe either of them were called John. In fact, the man I was dancing with was first to introduce himself to the others. When it came to Helen's partner, he seemed to pause for a second or two before giving his name as John. He seemed a bit apprehensive, and it was the only time I saw him look less than confident, because he seemed so certain of himself in every other way."
Neither Jeannie nor Helen really cared if the men that they were with were named John or something else, or whether they were married. The sisters just wanted to dance and have a good time. The four of them spent a little over an hour at the Barrowland before leaving there at 11:30 p.m. On their way out of the premises, Jeannie tried to buy cigarettes from a vending machine but lost her money due to a malfunction. Jeannie later told the police that Helen's red-haired companion became a bit irritated at this point and insisted on speaking to a manager. However, he didn't shout or cause any sort of scene. Instead, he spoke very calmly, almost schoolteacher-like, as if addressing a child. Jeannie thought that John might be kicked out by a bouncer for speaking to the manager in that way, but the manager surprisingly agreed with him and told Jeannie to come back the next day for a full refund. As they continued on their way, Helen's John murmured something like,
"My father says these places are dens of iniquity."
Outside, Helen's red-haired John and Jeannie walked toward Glasgow Cross to hail a taxi, while the other John headed to the city centre to catch a bus to Castlemilk. During the 20-minute drive back to Scotstoun, Jeannie noticed that John seemed even more irritated than he was before. She thought that maybe it was all just because that he saw her as a third wheel. Jeannie later told detectives that this John was approximately 25 to 30 years old, round about 6 feet tall with a medium build. He had light auburn reddish hair brushed to the right and greyish blue eyes. Jeannie had also noticed that this John had really good teeth, with one imperfection. One tooth on his upper right jaw overlapped the next tooth. That night, John was wearing a brownish, flecked, single-breasted suit, a knee-length brownish coat made of tweed or gabardine, a light blue shirt, and a dark tie with red diagonal stripes. Jeannie recalled that John had a metal badge on the lapel of his jacket, which he kept touching and rubbing for some reason. He was also smoking Embassy brand cigarettes. While John had shared very little about himself back at the Barrowland, in the taxi ride back to Scotstoun, he told sisters that his surname was either Templeton or Sempleson, and that he lived in the Castle Milk area with a relative, and that he was unmarried. Oddly, when Jeannie asked if John liked dancing, he became almost angry, ranting about adulterous women who attended the city's dance halls. He mentioned being raised in a very strict religious household, which explained his habit of quoting religious scripture throughout his conversations. When Jeannie asked John what he was planning to do on New Year's Eve, or Hogmanay as the Scottish say, he replied, "I don't dance at Hogmanay, I pray." So it got to about 12:30 AM on that Friday night, and the cab driver left Jeannie at her home on Kelso Street, before then taking John and Helen to Earl Street. Jeannie found it strange that John insisted the driver take her home first, which was about 800 metres further on. And when Jeannie was saying goodbye to Helen, telling her that they would see each other the following week, John had slammed the door shut, pretty much mid-sentence. The taxi dropped them off outside 95 Earl Street. The driver told the police Helen had gotten out and walked towards her home without looking back, whilst John paid for the fare and headed after her. An hour and a half later, a number 6 bus stopped between Gardner Street and Fortrose Street and picked up a passenger there. A young man with red hair stepped on board, looking embarrassed and roughed up, like he had been in some sort of fight. He had a red scratch on his face, and his jacket was all covered in mud. People on the bus noticed him constantly tucking a short cuff of one sleeve into his jacket. This detail is very important because a man's cufflink had been found next to Helen Puttock's body. The man got off the bus a short time later and was last seen heading towards the public ferry to cross the River Clyde to the south side of the city. A few days later, Glasgow newspapers started publishing stories about the Bible-quoting killer, along with Jeannie's description of John. Soon, the mysterious figure was given a name that we all recognise today, more than 50 years later: Bible John. After Helen's death, the police were sure that they were about to catch Bible John at any moment. There were too many witnesses and too many detailed descriptions of this guy's appearance and behaviour for him to go unidentified for much longer. Jenny was shown a portrait made by George Lennox Patterson, which she commented on by saying,
"My whole inside just churned. To me, the resemblance was there. When I looked at it, it's a funny feeling. It's like something just turns in your guts, you know? It's like a wee kind of shiver or something. When I saw that, I thought, God, that's a terrific resemblance."
Jeannie's reaction seemed to confirm that the person who killed her sister also murdered Jemima MacDonald. George and Jeannie teamed up to make the sketch of Bible John more accurate. This time, George created a full-colour version, which was sent to the press and spread all over the United Kingdom. Jeannie also worked with Glasgow City Police photo fit technicians to create another composite image of Bible John's face. Since this man had been wearing a watch popular with servicemen and had short, neat hair, his picture and description were sent to British Army bases and Royal Naval ships. The authorities felt confident that Bible John's reign of terror would finally come to an end. The appeals led to numerous reports from witnesses who had seen, or maybe thought they had seen, this man known as Bible John. The police spent countless hours investigating these leads and bringing men in for lineups, but Jeannie didn't recognise any of them. Meanwhile, the Barrowland Ballroom became a stakeout point where 16 police officers kept an eye on the attendees of this now infamous Over 25 night. To blend in, the investigators had to do everything they could not to stand out, leading the press to eventually nickname the group the Marine Formation Dance Team. Although the officers got better at dancing, they didn't have any luck finding suspects. When detectives checked British military and NATO records, the results were the same. There was no leads. They thought that this Bible John might have been sent abroad between the two murders, but they found nothing useful. The police also talked to more than 450 hairdressers in and around the Glasgow area, as well as many tailors and dentists. Bible John's hairstyle wasn't common for that time, but none of the barbers remembered seeing anyone who looked like him. Dentists checked their records for the cops for over 5,000 patients with a front tooth overlapping on the upper jaw, but again, this led nowhere. All 5,000 men were found and cleared. It wasn't just that the police couldn't catch Bible John, they couldn't find the other John either. The detectives really needed to talk to him, as he was the last known person to have seen Bible John alive. This other John earned the nickname Castle Milk John because, well, he was last seen heading to that area after their night out. Despite the police's best efforts, they couldn't track him down. It seemed like Castle Milk John was deliberately avoiding the authorities. Maybe he was a married man who had lied about his identity and didn't want anybody to know that he had been at Barrowland that night. Whatever his reasons are, the fact that he never stepped forward really set back this investigation. But when one clue led to a dead end, the detectives switched gears, determined to leave no stone unturned. They even visited over 400 golf courses throughout Scotland, because Jeannie recalled Bible John mentioning golf and a cousin who once scored a hole-in-one. They also checked out numerous churches, but no suspects turned up. The hunt for Bible John eventually became one of the largest investigations ever carried out by Scottish police. They went door to door, gathering over 50,000 witness statements. Within just a year, they had questioned more than 5,000 potential suspects and involved over 100 detectives and police officers in their efforts. Despite all of this, it seemed that the police were no closer to catching this Bible John. As traditional methods of investigation were hitting a brick wall, the Scottish Daily Record took a bold step and funded a trip for Dutch psychic and parapsychologist Gerard Croce to come across to Glasgow in the hopes of breaking the case wide open. Gerard believed that Bible John was hiding out in Govan, in a house with a distinctive appearance. Despite this tip, another round of door-to-door inquiries turned up empty. In the end, even the psychic detour was labelled just a waste of time, though it's worth noting that conventional methods hadn't been any more successful, so they may as well try everything. The investigation into the three murders gradually became cold, and resources were moved to be used in different cases. The only good thing seemed to be that while the police had failed to locate Bible John, he had also stopped killing. Maybe they got too close. Because no more murders followed the death of Helen Puttock, it was believed that Bible John had simply moved away, or continued killing somewhere else, or was maybe jailed for an unrelated offence, or was incarcerated in a mental hospital. Of course, it was possible that he simply decided to stop due to this massive manhunt closing in. It was difficult for the detectives to understand how nobody had come forward positively identifying this man, despite the detailed description and sketch. As Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie said after his retirement in 1976,
"Sometimes you get the ones you shouldn't get, and you don't get the ones you should. This one was one we should have got. We knew so much about him, it's quite incredible that this man has eluded us."
Over the years, several names have emerged as potential suspects in this case. One notable name, though, was John White, who was caught by the police in late 1969 outside the Barrowland Ballroom after an argument with a woman. Detective Les Brown, who was there, noticed that John bore a striking resemblance to Bible John and brought him in for questioning. However, there was a glaring mismatch. John White didn't have the distinctive overlapping front teeth that were a known trait of Bible John. Despite this, he remained a suspect for quite some time. Adding to the suspicions, it turned out that this John White was actually John Edgar, who had also provided a fake address to the cops. Ultimately, no evidence tied him to the Bible John murders, and he was released without charges. Years later, after Detective Brown wrote an autobiography that included a chapter on this John White, John Edgar actually reached out to the authorities, offering to provide a DNA sample to clear his name once and for all. Although this DNA test never actually happened, it seems unlikely that John Edgar was involved with these murders. Another suspect was a guy called John Irvin McInnes, a former soldier and furniture salesman with a strong religious background, known for his heavy drinking and gambling habits. Witnesses spotted this John at the Barrowland Ballroom on the night before Helen Puttock was tragically murdered, and he matched the general description of Bible John. However, during the investigation, John participated in several identity parades, and Jeannie Langford, a key witness in this investigation, she couldn't positively identify him as the man that she saw that night. Moreover, John's teeth were perfectly straight and they weren't crooked, and his prominent ears didn't match those described by Jeannie. So, by 1969, he was no longer considered a suspect. Surprisingly though, almost 30 years later in 1996, John McInnes, well, his past caught up with him when his body was exhumed as part of a renewed cold case effort. This drastic action underscored the enduring mystery surrounding the Bible John murders and the lengths to which investigators would go to try and solve this case. John McInnes had passed away in 1980 at the age of 41 from a self-inflicted wound that severed the brachial artery in his arm. Years later, a breakthrough seemed possible when a DNA sample taken from Helen Puttock's tights were linked to the McInnes family, described as an 80% match. Eager to solve the long-lasting mystery, investigators exhumed John's body to test his DNA, hoping to finally confirm whether or not he was Bible John. The anticipation was palpable. It seemed as though the case of Bible John might at last be resolved. However, the results from several DNA tests turned out to be inconclusive. So by July of 1996, John McInnes was once again cleared as a suspect, leaving the haunting questions about Bible John unanswered. The person who sparked the most speculation in connection with the Bible John murders was convicted serial killer Peter Tobin. In 2006, Tobin was found guilty of the brutal and murder of a Polish student called Angelika Kluk. After this heinous crime, investigators suspected that this was not Tobin's first violent offence. This suspicion was confirmed when the bodies of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol and 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton were discovered buried in the garden of a house where Tobin had once lived. As police dug deeper into Tobin's past, they uncovered that he had been living in Glasgow up until 1969. This was the exact same time period when the Bible John murders occurred. After 1969, Tobin moved off to Brighton following his marriage. Adding to the suspicions, it was revealed that Tobin frequented the Barrowland Ballroom regularly and was known for his sharp dressing style, similar to descriptions of Bible John. This convergence of details led to heightened scrutiny of Tobin in relation to the notorious unsolved case. Interestingly, Peter Tobin was also known to use aliases, one of which was John Semple, eerily similar to John Sempleson, a name that Jeannie recalled hearing in the taxi on that night before one of the murders. This detail added another layer of suspicion surrounding Tobin. The publication of the book The Lost British Serial Killer in 2010, which posited that Peter Tobin was actually Bible John, prompted several women to come forward with claims that they had been sexually assaulted by Tobin at the Barrowland Ballroom in the late 60s. Further bolstering suspicions, 3 of Tobin's former wives recounted harrowing experiences of being imprisoned, throttled, beaten, and by him. Notably, they mentioned his intense anger triggered by the female menstrual cycle, a specific detail that aligned with aspects of the Bible John case. With these alarming revelations, Peter Tobin emerged as a very likely candidate for Bible John. However, despite these compelling connections, several critical details in the timeline and characteristics conflicted with this theory. Jeannie Langford was sure that Peter Tobin wasn't the one who killed her sister after seeing his photograph. Additionally, Peter had moved to Brighton before Jemima MacDonald and Helen Puttock were even murdered. He got married on August 6th, celebrated his honeymoon in Brighton, and was arrested on August 20th for a different crime. Since Jemima MacDonald was killed on August 16th, it's unlikely that Peter was involved in her murder. Tobin himself showed zero interest in cooperating with the police, openly stating that he wasn't concerned about whether the victims' families found closure or not. He did, however, eventually open up to a prison pal in 2021. Ultimately, there's no evidence linking Peter Tobin to the Bible John murders. His DNA was compared with the sample from Helen Puttock's tights, and it wasn't a match. As a result, Peter was ruled out as a suspect, sending the police right back to square one. Today, 50 years after Bible John ended the lives of 3 young women who only wanted to enjoy a night out dancing, the mystery still remains unsolved. The cases of Patricia Docker, Jemima MacDonald and Helen Puttock are still open, each waiting for that missing puzzle piece that will finally unveil the true identity of their killer. Thanks ever so much for taking the time to watch this, or any of my videos. If you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, please. Tell someone that you love them, and remember, no matter what, keep smiling.